I probably should have known the job was too good to be true when I read the advertisement. Wanted, security guard for Highlands Mall off Highway 85, 6 p.m. to 7 a.m., Monday through Friday. $95,000 a year plus benefits. No previous security experience required. If interested, call Dwayne Maxwell at, and then there was a number provided. I took the notice off the bulletin board and just looked at it for a little bit. A job making almost $100,000 a year without any previous experience was unheard of. There were also benefits, which was something I could use right now. I assumed that I would call the number and it would turn out to be some kind of scam. It would be a front for some illegal activity, or it would reroute me to a telemarketing scheme that was just trying to get my information, but the guy who picked up on the third ring sounded real enough, and I told him I was interested in the job. He sounded relieved, which should have been my first warning. "That's great! When would you like to start? I have an opening available right now. I'm looking to fill it fairly quickly." Hold on. I've got some questions first." The guy on the other end, Dwayne Maxwell, I suppose, laughed and said, "I'd be suspicious if you didn't." "What's involved with the job?" I'd done a couple of years in a prison and then a couple of years working in a jail, so I had a little bit of security background, and none of them had ever paid that well. I was kind of hesitant to give this guy any information or to agree to much more than an interview, but the thought of making $95,000 a year, plus getting some health insurance, was too good to pass up. There had been a strange pain in my side for the last couple of years, and I've had a planter's wart on my foot that I'd really like to get scraped off. The thought that I might be able to do it without a huge out-of-pocket expense was certainly alluring. The location was also a little too good to be true, but I didn't voice that. The Highlands Mall has been something of a town staple since 1989. At one point, it held almost 100 different shops, as well as a food court with dozens of choices, a Dillard's, a Sears, and a Burlington coat factory, 2 arcades, a movie theater, and a fountain that was bigger than any 3 of the shops put together. Despite the online craze, the mall is still there. Most of the shops are closed, and I think the Dillard's is the only business that's still open. Mostly it's just empty, as if waiting for its time to come around again. I don't know why the mall needed a security guard when nothing inside it was open except a Dillard's, but I wasn't about to argue with them. We talked about it, and I told him I'd be happy to apply formally. A couple of days later, I arrived to find a different man waiting for me near the food court entrance. He was wearing a security uniform that I would soon become very familiar with, and he handed me one of my own in a garment bag, as well as a hat, a flashlight, and a big ring of keys. "I'd suggest you get a key clip for that. There's about 20 pounds of keys on that chain. There's a key for almost every gate in the mall, but I don't recommend you try going to open them. Most of them are just empty spaces, and there's nothing in them to be seen. A few of the stores still pay for storage, however, so if they see you poking around their stuff, they might decide you're stealing. Come on, I'll give you the tour." His name was Glenn, and he'd apparently been working at the mall for the last 10 years. He had worked as a security guard when the mall was still open, but then he'd gone into corrections and hadn't come back until after it closed. He remembered the mall fondly, telling me about each of the empty storefronts that had once been home to something great. He remembered the bookstore that had been set up in Section 2. He remembered getting shoes at the Payless. He remembered seeing a movie when the multiplex was still open. And he remembered eating at the food court on his break. The fountain still worked, and he told me it was one of the few original furnishings in the mall. It had sat there for over 30 years, but it still pumped water and was pretty cool to look at. He told me that my job would be to walk around and make sure that all the doors were locked. and then I would sit in the officer station and watch the cameras until morning. Then, after I checked the doors again, I'd be free to leave. 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. 12 hours of nothing but watching cameras. It sounded boring as hell, but they were paying me enough that I supposed I could manage. After the tour, Glenn took me up to the security room and showed me a wall of cameras. The new owners don't want anyone inside the mall other than the security guard. They would probably close the Dillards as well if they didn't have a contract. All they want you to do is watch the cameras and make sure that no one gets inside the mall. People have tried to break in before. I guess they think there's stuff in here worth stealing. If you see people moving around on the floor and trying to get into the place, you call the police and report a break-in. We don't expect you to go out there and chase them away. The police will be more than happy to help you. That being said, and I saw his eyes stray to the monitors as he said it, don't call the police for every little thing. Sometimes the monitors play tricks on you, and you have to be sure that they're living people out there. Just watch the monitors and keep a close eye on the doors. That's all you have to do. Simple enough, right? I told him it did sound pretty simple, and he told me that he would sit with me on the first night so that he could make sure I got the hang of it. We walked around and checked all the doors again, checked the empty storefronts and the empty halls, and then we went up to the security room, and I saw Glenn lock the door behind us. This seemed like a practiced move, and I wondered why he would bother if there was no one else there. Glenn told me that management didn't really care what we did once we were here, as long as no one got into the mall. He told me I was free to play on my phone or even bring in a laptop and work on something else, but I was expected to keep an eye on the monitors and report any movement when I saw it. Seemed like a weird statement, but I took my phone out and started watching YouTube as I kept my eyes going back and forth between the monitors. The work seemed pretty easy. There was really nothing to do other than look at empty corridors full of nothing. I noticed that Glenn didn't follow my lead. He sat in front of the monitors and stared at them, his eyes almost unblinking as he seemed to look for something. It was a little unnerving, but I figured the guy just took his job seriously. I'd looked up from a TikTok, and that was the first time I saw one of them. The man was standing there, staring at the camera, framed in the caged door that had once been a Jamba Juice a long time ago. He wasn't moving. He wasn't even breathing. He was just standing there and staring at us through the lens of the camera. I sat up, startled, and went to reach for the phone on the desk. Glenn's hand covered mine as I did so, and when I looked back at him, he shook his head slowly without taking his eyes off the man. Stand down. We only call the police when people are moving. I was confused. What do you mean? There's someone in the mall. We gotta call the cops and get them removed. Glenn slowly shook his head again, and as he took his eyes off the screen, it looked like it cost him a great deal to do so. Only if they move. The ones that don't move are no threat. They just stand there. Nobody knows why. Maybe they're ghosts. Maybe they're after images from the old camera system. I don't know. But what I do know is that when you go down there to remove them, there's no one there. They're always gone. And when the police get there, there's no one to arrest. I asked him if he saw these people often, and he told me it was a nightly occurrence. It only happens after the sun goes down. I always see at least one, but some nights are more active than others. Some nights it's a few. Some nights it's as many as 7, but the day shift guy says he never sees anybody. It's only something that happens on night shift, and it's part of the reason they pay so much. The images seem to weird people out a little bit. Some of them get obsessed with what they are and why they're here. Some of them start to talk about being watched. But a lot of people find that they can't handle it and they just quit. We had a guy a couple of years ago, Dave, who swore that one night he saw all 26 cameras with somebody staring at him from each one of them. We all thought he was nuts. There'd never been that many, but he said he had seen it, and I didn't have any reason to doubt him. A couple of months later, he just kind of disappeared. Sometimes they do that as well. I don't want to scare you on your first night, and I wouldn't take it amiss if you decided to quit. The job's been good to me, and I seem to be able to handle it better than most. It's Monday through Thursday, and there's a different guy who works the weekends. You may get to swap shifts every now and again, especially if one of you wants a vacation. For the most part, you'll work your 412s in a row, and then you'll have the weekend to yourself. I would suggest you use it to decompress. Find a hobby, find a book series or a movie series that you like. Take up models, but do something so your mind doesn't come back here. That was the only one we saw that night, and the next day it was just me on shift by myself. I learned that Glenn had been transferred to day shift since he was the one who had my position before me. I still saw him sometimes. He would relieve me in the mornings, or I would relieve him in the evenings, and it appeared that he was my counterpart on the day shift. I didn't watch the screens quite as religiously as he did, but I still saw the figures regularly. It wasn't just adults either. Sometimes I would look up and there would be a little kid standing near the food court, or outside the peeling edifice of the old KB Toys, just staring up at me as if I'd canceled Christmas. Mostly it was just solo people, but every now and again you would get twos or threes. Grouped may be the wrong word there. They were never standing near each other, but you would see them in the same frame. One of them might be standing in the shadows of an alcove. One of them might be peeking from behind a vending machine, and another one might be standing dead center of camera 6. But they were all staring. Glenn had been right. There were always one, at least one a night, but some nights were busier than others. On a particularly busy Wednesday, I saw no less than 5 of them within a 3-hour period. It was the nights that I didn't see any of them that made me nervous. Just because I didn't see them didn't mean that they weren't there. It just made me realize that I wasn't noticing them. It became a perpetual game of Where's Waldo, and I was always a little startled when I finally picked them out. I'd been on the job about 2 weeks when I started noticing something else wandering around the mall. At first I thought that maybe Glenn had come back after hours because he'd forgotten something. But now, I believe you couldn't have gotten Glenn back here after dark for blood or money. I would look up every now and again, and instead of the usual people in polo shirts or t-shirts and jeans and a halter top, I saw what looked like a security guard. He was wearing the same uniform I was wearing, except he had a cap that was pulled over his face. He had a flashlight in his hand, but there was no light coming out of it. He was standing in different places, and anytime he was on the floor, it seemed that there were more ghost people. If the night watchman were out, which was what I started calling him, then there would be as many as 4 or 5 of the apparitions at a time. It was really weird, but I also found myself studying the figure closer. There was a name stenciled on his uniform top, making it different than mine since mine was blank, but the CCTV cameras just weren't good enough for me to make it out. The cap would never let me be sure that he was looking at me, but it always felt like his eyes were on me. Most of the people would go away after a while, but the night watchman would move from place to place. Sometimes you would catch him in different cameras for hours, sometimes only for a few minutes, but he was the only one I ever saw move around that much. I asked Glenn if he'd ever seen him, and Glenn said that he'd never seen anyone in a security uniform before. He wondered who it could be, but I got the feeling he wasn't telling all of it. I remembered the story he had told me about Dave, and I wondered if Dave might be our phantom night watchman. I didn't wonder it hard enough to go looking for him, but it was definitely a mystery. Then last night, something happened that made me wonder if I'll ever go back to the guard post again. It was Thursday night, and I only had to make it till morning before I could enjoy the weekend. The activity had been slow that night. A couple of apparitions by the water fountain, a couple more in the food court, a persistent one over by what had once been the ladies' Foot Locker, but right around 2 in the morning, I saw the night watchman, and I knew things were about to get bad. I could almost feel it. Sure enough, no sooner had he appeared than 5 cameras showed the ghost people that I'd come to look for. They were more abundant now, too, in several frames, and at least one in about 8 of the camera monitors. They were just standing there, staring at me like they thought I might have the answer to some question. I started to look back down at my phone, but it was hard to look away from them. They were so intent on me that it felt like I was an animal in a zoo. And as the watchman moved around, suddenly there were more and more of them. I wanted to look away. I wanted to look anywhere but at the monitors, but suddenly they were all I could focus on. I hadn't understood when Glenn stared at them so fervently, but now I got it. You had to keep your eyes on them. You had to keep looking at them, or else they'd know, and then they'd get you. Maybe they would come into the station, but maybe they wouldn't. Maybe watching was the only way to keep them out. Maybe. My phone made a noise, and I looked down to find that I had a text from a friend of mine. I looked down for a second, less than a second, and when I looked up, I nearly fell out of my chair. They were no longer standing on the floor, and their faces suddenly filled the monitors. They were all staring at me, their unblinking eyes staring into me. Worst of all was the night watchman. He was standing in the middle screen, the one in the dead center of the screen bank, and he was glaring at me with eyes deep enough to fall into. I scooted my chair as far away from them as I could get, but it felt like they might come spilling out of the monitors at any moment. They just stared and stared for what felt like hours, and the longer it went on, the more I felt myself unraveling. I wanted to leave. I wanted to run, but I knew that if I left, they'd get me. They were just waiting for me to open the door, and then they would all be standing there just staring at me as they came pouring in. I don't know how long I stared at them, but when somebody banged on the door, I jumped and actually fell out of my chair. Somehow, I'd missed the sun coming up. And when my relief asked if I was okay and if I was still there, I looked back at the monitors and everyone was gone. The mall was empty, as it always was. And I got up and let him in as I ran out of the station and headed for my car. The daytime guy must have talked to Glenn, because when he called me and asked if I wanted to meet for coffee or something, I agreed. I certainly wasn't going to be doing any sleeping that day, and he chose a booth as far from everyone else as he could, as we sat and discussed what had happened. Glenn shook his head and said that he should have been honest from the beginning. I told you about Dave, the guard who came a few guards before you. I told you he got obsessed with the people on the monitors. He kept talking about them, talking about how they all stared at him, and he wanted to know who they were. I told him to let it alone, that it was a mystery, but it was a mystery that he would never solve. Dave just couldn't let it go. He did some digging and uncovered that some of the people he'd been seeing had gone missing in the mall back in the 80s and 90s. It's a big mall. People do sometimes go missing, but usually it's because they left the mall or because, they were abducted or something. In these cases, the people were never found. The children never turned up. No one ever found so much as a ransom note or a body in a ditch anywhere. The more he discovered, the more obsessed Dave become. I told him not to go wandering around after dark, but one night he did just that. They pulled up the CCTV footage, and you could see Dave walking around with his flashlight out, shouting at people, even though there was no sound on any of the monitors. He was calling for people, trying to get them to come out, and then everything fuzzed over, and suddenly, he's just gone. It sounds like he's not as gone as I thought he was. It stirred them up. I don't know what to tell you. I can't tell you to quit or to keep coming to work, but I can tell you to do what you feel you have to do. I've got a couple of days off, but still don't know what I should do. I'm just not sure that I can come back and stare at those monitors again and see the people appear in the darkness. I don't know. But I know I don't want to end up like Dave, and leaving might be the best thing for me. They called it the Starjet once. It was a huge roller coaster at Casino Pier in Seaside Heights, and my dad talks about it like it was magic. He rode it when he was younger, said it was easily the best coaster he'd ever seen, and Dad's rode roller coasters all over the place, so he'd know. It must have made an impression because he became an engineer so that he could design them, and my childhood was full of trips to this park or to that park, so he could stand at the base of some hulking metal construction and say, "Caroline, your daddy designed this, and now we're gonna ride it." I never got to ride it myself. Never quite got tall enough to meet the requirements. You see, in 2012, Hurricane Sandy rolled in, and when the rain cleared, the Starjet was no longer on the pier and now resided out in the ocean. It hadn't gone far, though. It was just off the coast, still well within sight, but its days of giving rides were over. The city never cleaned it up, never demolished it, and it was deemed too expensive to be bothered with. It more or less just sits off the coast in New Jersey, and the last name it was given before the storm seems very fitting. If you stand on the beach and look at it, you can still see the faded letters that dub it the Hurricane. I'm not a kid anymore. I'm a senior in high school now, and I'd figured I'd heard the last of the old coaster. I assumed it would fall apart out in the water and become a reef, or that eventually it would rust into nothingness and float away, but when a friend of mine said that her friend had actually ridden on the coaster, I shook my head and scoffed. "Oh yeah? How did they manage that? It's been out in the middle of the bay for close to 15 years. "Yeah, well, she says that a friend of hers heard that it was running out there. Margot, you know, my cousin, said that one of her friends took her out there and they rode the coaster like it was still the same as it was in the old days. She said it's free now, but you don't have to buy a ticket, and that they rode it a couple of times and then they went home." We were behind the gym, smoking cigarettes and just kind of hanging out in between classes, and I flipped my butt into a nearby ditch before fixing Helen with a withering look. "Helen, that roller coaster doesn't just run on fairy dust. I don't think they've got the power capability to run an old roller coaster out in the middle of the ocean. I think maybe your cousin was having a little fun with you, maybe sharing a spooky story." Helen tossed her own cigarette into the ditch and shook her head. "Margot isn't into that kind of thing. If she says she rode it, then she rode it. I think we ought to go check it out. Aren't your parents going out of town this weekend? Maybe we could go check it out and have a couple of rides on it. Your dad would freak if he knew we had actually ridden the Hurricane." She wasn't wrong. My dad had loved that old roller coaster, and the idea that he could ride it again would have really brought a smile to his face. Dad hadn't been doing so well that year. He'd had a run-in with cancer, but this was just the sort of thing that would perk him up, maybe help him in his recovery. I didn't think for a minute that we would manage to get my dad out there. He was almost 50 and his legs just don't work the way they used to, but maybe we could get some pictures and show him that the old hurricane was still up and running. All right, what could it hurt? Let's go for one last ride and see what your cousin is talking about. I didn't believe for a second that the roller coaster was actually running. It would have taken a technological marvel, the likes of which that Disney wasn't even aware of, to get the hurricane up and running in the middle of the ocean, but I did want to snap some pictures of the old roller coaster for posterity. Plus, Dad would enjoy them, and I like seeing Dad smile these days. Helen said that she was going to ask Tracy and Selena to come with us, maybe even get Margot to come along if she would do it. I told her to bring half the school if that's what she wanted to do, but I only had room in my boat for 5, so the guest list would need to be pretty small. She came back during lunch and told me that everyone, including Margot, said that they were absolutely down to see the hurricane. So after Mom and Dad left for some sort of doctor's appointment in New York, I had the girls over, and we had some dinner before we headed out. Tracy and Selena were excited at the prospect of seeing the old roller coaster, but I don't think either of them really thought we'd get to ride it. Margot, Helen's cousin, who was about 3 years older than her and already in college, told them that it was nothing they had ever experienced, and they might want to dress warmly or wear ponchos. I rode it the year before it closed, but it was nothing like it was back then. It's like riding inside an actual hurricane. The wind and the rain and the constant turns and twists. And as she talked about it, I noticed that her eyes got a little far away and scared looking. It's unlike any roller coaster I've ever seen before. How it operates out in the middle of the water, I don't know, but it's absolutely worth a look. Everyone was excited, all of us wanting to have a peek at this mysterious roller coaster. And as the sun began to set, we all loaded up into Dad's little boat and headed out to the site of the hurricane. There are signs out there around it telling you to be cautious because of debris in the water, but mostly they're out there to keep people from going out to the hurricane and trying to climb on it and getting hurt. You can see it all from the shore, but it was the first time I'd seen it lit up. There were actual lights on around the roller coaster, showing the twists and turns and catching the spray of the waves in it. It was spooky, like seeing a kraken rise out of the ocean. I was a little hesitant to get close as we came up on it, and what I had thought were waves turned out to be cars running along the tracks. There shouldn't have been any way that could be. It should have been impossible, but they were there. You could see the cars go around the turns or go over the hairpins, and then they would return to the cradle. I told you, Margot said as she pointed at the coaster. It still works. Come on, let's go. There were other boats pulled up to the little dock that had been set up outside the hurricane. I saw a couple of skiffs and a little motorboat, but we never saw anybody else. I suppose maybe they were checking out the gift shop, ha ha, and as we mounted the platform where you got onto the car, I saw it come to rest in the cradle and watched as the safety bar opened to allow people to get on. We didn't get in right away. We stood there for a minute just looking at it, and after about 2 or 3 minutes, the safety bars came back down, and the car shot off across the tracks yet again. The whole ride took about 1.5 minutes, and it came to rest in the cradle again as the safety bars came up. Come on, Helen said as she ran towards the cars. Let's get on. Selena and Tracy seemed a little bit hesitant. Who's operating this thing? Selena said as she looked around and tried to find out who was manning the controls of the roller coaster. I don't know, Margot said as she drew up short from the car. Maybe it's all automated or something. Who knows? But it works. I don't see anybody splattered on the tracks, so let's get on. Tracy hung back, but Selena ran forward to jump into a car before she could think better of it. Margot was already getting in, and Helen was getting in beside her. The two of them looked at me as if to ask if I was going to chicken out now, and I slid in beside Selena. The safety bar popped down, and the car began to move. It was a weird feeling, watching Tracy disappear behind us as the coaster began to climb up the first hill. Before we had gotten on, the wind had been pretty mild, and the spray had been nothing to write home about. It was just a typical night, nothing out of the ordinary. But the higher we got, the more the wind began to whip, and the more the water began to fall down on us. It was almost as if a light rain had begun, and I was glad for the poncho that I had worn pretty quickly. Selena had come out in her jeans and a band t-shirt, and pretty quickly she was soaked to the skin. The waves began to get higher, too. As they crashed against the coaster, they would shake the frame and send water up and over the cart more than once. Helen and Margot laughed as if it was the coolest thing they had ever seen, but I knew enough about roller coasters to know that you probably weren't supposed to get them wet, especially not the machinery. A little wet was okay, and some of them had been set up to submerge, but I didn't think that the Starjet, or the Hurricane, was one of them. As we came to the top of the hill, I remember looking down into the water as it pooled around the tracks, and being pretty sure that we were about to smash into the rocks that had come up between them, and this was going to be my last coaster ride. We came down, but we must have missed the rocks because we continued forward unimpeded. The rain and the wind got even worse, and when we turned, we were hit with spray and thick droplets as the wind whipped everything into our faces. A few times I was struck by something a little thicker, hail perhaps, but it was so disorienting that it was really hard to remember. Riding the coaster was like being in an actual hurricane, and every turn brought us more and more pelting rain and whipping wind. After a while, I couldn't even see the tracks. It was like we were inside a cyclone, inside a monsoon, and something was lingering just outside the rain as it watched us. It was huge, a giant that had risen from the water, and I could feel its many eyes on me as we rode the hurricane. The ride was only supposed to be a minute and a half, but it felt like we rode the roller coaster for hours. Later, I would discover that my face was windburnt. There were bruises on my arms and legs where the hail had struck them too. My poncho was soaked through, the water not something it was ever designed to disperse. And when we finally came to a stop in the cradle again, I was out of breath and having trouble getting to my feet. Selena got me up and out of the ride just before it started up again, but Helen and her cousin weren't so lucky. Lucky may not have been the right word. They didn't want to get off the ride. We called to them as Selena and I hunkered down on the ramp that would have led us to the cars, and Tracy came up to make sure that we were okay as the two girls rode the hurricane again. I was in no shape to ride anything. I was having trouble catching my breath, and my lungs burned like I'd been walking through a winter evening. I was having a mild asthma attack, I believe, and as I sat there and tried to regain control of my breathing, I watched the coaster fly through the turns and ride the hills yet again. I couldn't believe they had wanted to go a second time. Once had been more than enough for me. When the coaster came back to the cradle yet again, the girls were still calling for more. Their faces had begun to peel, their skin red and angry looking, but they refused to get off and told us to go on without them. They looked like people in a religious experience, and they insisted that they would find some way back to shore. We stayed for nearly a half an hour, but after a while, we got back in the boat and went home. I told myself that they would take one of the other boats that were already docked there, but neither Helen nor Margot were ever seen again. Her mother came to my house and asked if I'd seen them, and I had to lie and tell them that they'd left my house early and gone somewhere that I didn't know about. Tracy and Selena must have told them a similar story, because the police labeled them both as runaways, and the case was closed pretty quickly. I don't know what to think about my experience out there on the hurricane, but it's an experience I don't want to repeat. I've ridden roller coasters from coast to coast, but that was something different. It was like being inside of a storm and sensing something bigger than you has control of the wind and the rain. I believe that whatever guards the hurricane wanted it to be out there. It wants to bring people out there so it can keep them there for as long as their bodies can handle it. I believe that the boats that were there were from people who got on and just never got off again. I still look at the hurricane sometimes. You can see it from the dock beyond my house, and at night it still lights up and invites people to come inside. I'll never go again. Some experiences are best lived only once. The house has been there for about 70 years. It's called the Preacher's House, and it was built for the pastor of River Valley Pentecostal, a church that once lay near the gully. It was home to one pastor or another before the church burned down in 1986. The pastor who lived there before the fire decided to stay in the house, and since he kept paying taxes on it, no one said anything about it. Technically, the land was owned by the church, but since there was no church anymore, it felt all right to let him continue to stay there. When he died about 10 years ago, people started trying to explore the house, but no one had ever gotten past the front door. No one that I know of, anyway. My brother and his friends went up there on a dare when they were in high school, and he said everything about the place felt wrong. The yard was overgrown with goldenrod and witchgrass. You could see things hunkered in the yard like monsters, but they were just regular things when you got right up on them. There had been a bird bath and a swing set, and even a little green three-wheeled bike that was mostly rusted into nothingness. He and his friends had come up on the ranch-style house, but he said that when he had wrapped his hand around the doorknob, he had heard something deep in the house make a loud banging noise, and all of them had run away. None of them wanted to find out what the source of that noise was, but it was something that became an obsession of mine for several years. Most of it is the legend that surrounds the church before it burned to the ground. Some of the townspeople that used to go there said the preacher had a falling out with some of his deacons. It was said that they had gotten a hold of something not altogether righteous, and the preacher hadn't wanted to keep it in the church. There were other rumors that whatever it was had infected his daughter, a girl of about 8, and she had been the one to burn the church down. Whatever the case, the pastor had lived in town for 20 years before he finally passed on, and no one had ever been up there to the house after the night when the church burned down. He didn't invite anyone in, and no one was allowed past the door if they did go up there. He came into town once every couple of weeks to do his shopping, and those who tried to get in said that the house was very odd. Looking through the windows, they said there was nothing inside except religious pictures and symbols. He had bookshelves, but did not appear to have a TV. The windows were in the living room and in the dining room, and from there, you could see the decor was consistent into the kitchen and into the hallway that led back to the bedrooms. There were supposed to be 3 bedrooms, and people often wondered what he used those other bedrooms for. They wondered what had happened to his daughter as well. They wondered if maybe she was still in the house, still sick with whatever had infected her. A lot of people had questions, but very few people were looking for answers. I was 16 when I went to the house, and I didn't need to be dared to go there. The house and the church had become something of an obsession for me. I did school reports about the fire of '86. I did genealogy studies on the pastor and his family, and some of my teachers and friends had suggested that I might be doing an unhealthy amount of research when it came to the place. I didn't know what to tell them. It was just something I was interested in. If I had taken an interest in trains or World War II dioramas, there would have been very little said about it. But since it was something of a town legend that had caught my attention, I suppose they thought it was troubling. Why I never went to the house before then was something of a mystery, even to me. I guess it was the strangeness that surrounded it. I was as afraid of the place as everyone else, and I didn't want them to see me terrified of something that had so enthralled me. I suppose I thought that when the time was right, I would feel like I needed to go there. Until then, I'd continue to do my research and look for answers in the ashes of that old church. My fear of the house didn't stop me from going to the church, or what was left of it. The lot was still there. There was even a swing set behind it, though it was little more than rusty chains and a wooden frame. There's a concrete roundabout that sits naked and lonely in the dirt. I went out there to have a look, inspecting the grounds, and saw what I could find, but there was something strange that caught my eye. There's a big rock right in the middle of the church ground. It would have been where the church house was before it burned, and I suspected that it might be covering something. The rock is huge, something it would have taken several grown men to lift, and I often question what might be hidden under there. Maybe it's the grave of whatever the pastors and the deacons had fought over. Maybe it was there to keep something in the ground. Whatever the case, I would never be able to find out unless I convinced several very large friends of mine to lift the rock, and I just didn't know anybody who would be willing to do it. No, what finally drove me to explore the house was my father accepting a new job. He was taking a job in the next state over, with more money and the chance to be a supervisor instead of just another worker. I didn't want to move. I liked the place I lived in, but I was 16 and I didn't have a lot of options. Dad said we'd be moving at the end of the school year, and I realized that my chance to explore the house was slipping away. I needed to know what was in the old pastor's house, so I decided that it was time to pay my visit. I went one afternoon in March. I'd already decided to go during the day, thinking it would cut down on a lot of the creep factor. I had a half day at school and told my mom I was going over to a friend's house. I told Ralph that if my mom asked, he was to tell her that I was over there. And when he asked why, I told him not to ask a lot of questions, and that I would tell him later. Ralph had nodded, knowing that sometimes I went out on weird little explorations, and told me to be careful. If I thought the house would be less scary during the daytime, I'd been wrong. It was just as creepy with the sun out. The wind blew through the witchgrass, and the goldenrod made a skeletal sound this late in the season as it swayed. I could see the bird bath and the tricycle that my brother had talked about, the bird bath now laying on its side in two pieces, and the tricycle little more than a rusty hulk. The swing set hadn't gone anywhere yet, but it looked as if a good wind might push it to pieces. One lone swing still hung from it, and the chain made a squalling noise that was almost unbearable. The paving stones that led to the door were choked with stray grass and stunted goldenrod, and they wiggled oddly as I made my way towards the front door. The door loomed up before me like some kind of portal to hell, but I knew that it was now or never, and I wanted to see inside. I expected it to be locked, but to my surprise, the knob turned, and the hinges creaked as the door opened slowly onto the living room. I had heard rumors that the walls were covered in religious symbols. The stories had not done it justice. Every inch of the living room, the entryway, and the spaces in between were overrun with crosses, pictures of Christ, or other items that bore symbols of faith. There was no television, and the bookshelf sagged under years of disuse and dust. The whole place was shadowy, and as I took out my flashlight and swept it around, I could see that the walls of the dining room were similarly decorated. He had collected some of those religious oil paintings that you sometimes saw in the houses of older people. There were pictures of Jesus at Calvary, pictures of saints that had gone about their various works, pictures of the Garden of Eden and the walls of Jericho, and other stories from the Bible. It was like a religious museum of art. And as I came into the house, I became aware of a smell that hit me like a wall. I thought maybe it was just a smell of rotten groceries from the kitchen, but when my foot came down on something and crunched, I realized it was the smell of death. The floor was riddled with the bones of small animals, mice, moles, birds, even a few large animals like foxes and woodchucks. The farther into the house I went, the more desiccated animals I found. I saw a fox slumped over near a moldering old chair. I saw another woodchuck half in and half out of the kitchen. I saw a hawk skeleton as it lay across the couch, and all of it seemed to be heading in the direction of the hallway. I took that to mean there was something in the hallway that they had wanted to see, and as I made my way towards the back of the house, I felt the dread that had been hanging around me deepen. The religious pictures and crucifixes had doubled when I came into the space. There wasn't a clear piece of wall to be seen anywhere. There were 2 doors, both of them closed, both of them covered with symbols. Someone had written on the ceiling in what appeared to be Latin, and mixed amongst it were familiar words from other languages as well. I recognized French and Spanish and English, but I thought there might be Japanese characters and Germanic runes up there as well. From the English words, I decided it was some sort of prayer. What I could understand of it led me to believe that it might be a prayer for something to stay, or to never leave. Bind it, keep it, hold it until judgment. This is the will of our Lord, and the will of his servant. Bind its hands, darken its eyes, hobble its feet, keep safe its fury. Let this place be its tomb. Let this place be its prison. Let this place hold it for all time, for it is legion, and it is hungry. I was reading the ceiling, my flashlight held aloft, when I heard something rattle the 3rd door, the one at the back of the house. It hit it hard enough to make the chains that stretched across it jingle. It hit the door hard enough to make the crosses on the wall shake. It hit the door hard enough to make dust fall from the ceiling and from the knickknacks. And as it did, it growled deep in its chest. It sounded like the biggest dog I had ever thought of, and suddenly I wanted it to stay right behind that door, right along with my curiosity. I didn't want to know what was on the other side. I wished I'd never come to this house, because I'd never been so close to this kind of danger before in my life. As I backed away, it kept right on slamming its body against the door, sending pieces of popcorn ceiling tumbling down as well. The hallway looked like it had just received a dusting of snow, and before I could retreat to the living room, I heard something even worse than the growling. I heard it speak. "Marcus! Come on, Marcus! Come get me out of here. I know you know who I am. You've always known. Help me out. I'll tell you all the secrets of the universe. I'll tell you about the church and about what they kept beneath the church. Come and help me, and I'll give you more than you could have ever dreamed of receiving." Despite how scared I was, the scariest thing was that I actually considered it. I found myself taking a step towards the door before I got a hold of myself. Whatever was on the other side was saying what I needed to hear to go and inspect it, and it seemed to know it. It knew what I wanted. It knew how to tempt me, and when I started to back away again, it loosed a growl deep enough to make me think that the old priest had a tiger kept back there. "Don't run away from me, you cowardly piece of shit! Let me out! Let me out! I'll do whatever you want. I'll tell you whatever you want to know. I'll do whatever you want me to do. I'll show you things you've never even imagined. But first, you have to open this goddamn door!" I ran then, hearing the pounding as I left. I imagined I could hear the pounding as I climbed on my bike and rode back to town. I imagined I could still hear the pounding when I got back to the front porch of my house, and it didn't seem to stop until I closed the door behind me and leaned against it as I stood there panting. My parents weren't home yet, and I went to my room and tried to come to terms with what I had seen and heard in the house that I'd been so obsessed with for all these years. We moved not long after that. It was almost a mercy that we were leaving. Every dream I had until we moved had been about that house and listening to whatever was behind that door, trying to tempt me into opening it. The voice had been guttural, but there had maybe been a feminine quality to it as well. I can only imagine what might lie behind that door. But it was something else that it mentioned that kept me thinking about it. It had mentioned that it would tell me what they were keeping beneath the church, something that I now believe resides underneath that boulder on the property. That was, God, 6 or 7 years ago, and I try my best not to think about it any more than I have to. I still have dreams sometimes, but now I try my best to put them out of my mind. Otherwise, I might find myself going back to that house someday and discovering what lies behind the door in the house by the gully. Everybody thinks icebergs are these giant, majestic things that just sort of exist placidly in the environment. People hear the word glacier and they think about the thing that sank the Titanic, or those big islands of ice that penguins and seals sit on sometimes. They don't think about how they form or how they move. That's right, they do move. Ice flows can be extremely destructive, but they can also be quite beautiful. They can be quite beautiful when they're out in the water, not when they get as close as the ones I usually see. I live in a coastal town in Newfoundland. My grandmother left me a cottage and about 4 acres of land outside the town she grew up in. I can go to the water whenever I feel like, without feeling particularly inconvenienced, and it's nice to have a place to fish and go canoeing whenever I take a mind to. I'm something of a hermit. I don't go into town any more than I have to, and I don't really interact with the people there when I do. My grandmother was very social, giving money to the ladies' auxiliary or helping out with the local celebrations, but none of them knew me, and I don't have the connection to the community that she did. Most of the time, I really only head into town once every couple of months to buy supplies before returning to my home. I don't remember anyone's names. I don't even really interact with them if I can help it, and that's just the way I like it. Most of what I do this time of year is remind tourists that this isn't public land and they need to go glacier watching somewhere else. People sometimes flock to the coast this time of year so they can watch the glaciers go by. It's something of a tourist attraction, and there's even a festival in town, so that they'll stay there and spend some money before they go back to wherever they came from. They like to crowd along the coast and take pictures of the ice as it moves right along the coastline, and the signs that I put up barely deter them. Personally, I usually sit inside with my noise-canceling headphones on and try my best to ignore the whole thing. To me, the glaciers are usually nothing but a nuisance. It started the first year I was there. I'd never been to the cabin until after my grandmother died, and it seemed a shame to leave it empty. My parents had left me a trust, and between power, taxes, and supplies, I had plenty of money to do whatever I wanted. I decided that Grandma's old cabin would be the perfect place to write a book or record a podcast or do whatever else I took a mind to do. So I packed up my computer, some clothes, and a few other things that I wanted to bring with me, and I moved out to the middle of nowhere. It was honestly nice for the first couple of months. I'd moved there during the warmer months, what passes for summer, and I knew I would need enough supplies and a lot of luck to make it through the winter. The winter wasn't as bad as I had expected it would be, just a lot of snow and many days behind the door with the fire blazing. I got a lot of writing done for the winter months, cracking out most of a book before the snow began to melt and spring had officially sprung. That was the first time I heard one of them. The first time I was awoken by the screaming of the glaciers. The lady at the store where I bought my supplies had told me that glacier season would be starting in a couple of weeks, and I might see them floating by. I nodded at her and collected my stuff up to go. The glaciers would stay in the water. I had Googled that, and I wasn't really worried about something that was going to be off the coast. I figured I would just stay inside, pull my canoes up to the shore, and continue to bang out my novel. Instead, I was awoken by the most god-awful noise I had ever heard at about 4 a.m. in the morning the next day. At first, I thought it was someone being murdered. It sounded like the screaming of a woman mixed in with the agonized bellows of old machinery. I got up and grabbed my torch, throwing on a jacket as I went out into the front yard. I didn't know what to expect, but as my flashlight fell across the solid sheet of ice that lay about 50 feet away from me, I found myself craning my neck up as I looked at the glacier. It was huge, probably the biggest thing I had ever seen, and as it ground its way across the coastline, it went right on screaming in agony. I felt the torch slip out of my hand as I just stared at it in awe. I'd never seen or heard anything quite like it, and as the sun began to peak over the horizon, I remember going inside and shutting the door as if that would stop the sound. I tried to go to bed, tried to put my head under the pillow and block out the noise, but all I could hear was the screaming of the ice as it ground against the shoreline. It got worse as time went on. The glacier migration could last weeks, if not a month or more. The sound was different for each of the glaciers, sometimes sounding like a wounded animal, sometimes sounding like nothing that I'd ever heard before. It would happen so suddenly, something you wouldn't have thought would be possible with something so big, but one minute I would be making tea or writing some pages or getting ready for bed, and the next I would hear the sudden screaming of the ice and feel my body shaking involuntarily. The longer I listened, the more I thought I heard. Most people would have thought it was just the ice making noise for no reason at all, but the longer I listened, the more I heard actual words. It sounded like the snarling of an angry animal. It sounded like the screaming of frightened people. I could hear the stories of what might be inside the ice. I could hear the disdain and the anger of the things that might be trapped there. It was terrifying. It sounded as if the ice were being cut to pieces by the unmoving and unwavering shoreline. Then, one night, I saw a particularly big glacier coming and knew the sound was going to be hellacious. From the first time it touched the shore, I could tell that this was no seal or bird or ancient man trapped within it. A thunderstorm had rolled in, and as the lightning flashed and the rain came down, I could see something inside the glacier. It was huge, larger than anything I had ever seen, and it felt as if it was looking at me. It was trapped within the depths of the murk, a miasma of midnight, and as the ice scraped against the shore, I heard the creature within revel at the sound and the freedom it hoped to achieve. Break my prison. Open my cell. Let me feed again. Every thunderstrike, every arc of vicious lightning showed me more than I cared to see. I closed my door, put on my headphones, but I could still hear it. Whatever lay within had been alive when the earth was new. It had lived, it had fed, it had loved, it had survived, and then it had been placed inside this prison for what many had thought would be all time. It wanted to be free, but it knew it could be patient. Time was nothing to the creature. It could wait until the sun imploded if it needed to. That was the first time, but it wasn't the last. There are many such prisons for the things that time has forgotten, and whatever is inside, it's as if the ice has no choice but to slice itself mercilessly upon the shore. The glaciers are stuck in their ways, as many people are. If you listen closely, you can begin to understand their agony and their purpose. I don't feel sorry for them. They were monstrous, huge ice walls, and if they wanted to change, then I feel like they could. The only thing that keeps me from selling the cabin and moving somewhere else is the memory of Grandma and the letters that she had sent me about how beautiful the countryside was and how much she loved the place. Also, and this is probably more important, where would I go? Knowledge is sometimes as much a prison as those glaciers, and now I know what they hold. How could I feel safe and secure anywhere? So I learned to cope. I bought noise-canceling headphones. I bought music to drown it out. I taught myself to ignore the noise, but none of it blocked it out completely. It seemed I would always be subject to the screaming of the ice as it was mutilated, prisoner to the voices that lay within it. And it seemed I was the only one. People gather and take pictures of the glaciers. News crews come by to do stories about their migrations. The locals would celebrate like this was some great event. And all the while, the glaciers would just go right on screaming. I wanted to scream too. I wanted to tell the people they were celebrating something awful, but I doubt they would listen. I would be just one more crazy person, yelling about the suffering of the ice until somebody had me committed. So if you're coming to watch the glacier migration, just be aware of what it represents. The glaciers are not simply a piece of beautiful, majestic landscape. They suffer so that you can have your pictures and your experiences. Their pain is to hold in things better left forgotten, and they grind themselves against the shore to mark the passage of the sentence. They are their jailers, their prison, and they suffer right along with them. Think about that as you watch them, and for God's sakes, stay the hell off my lawn. The only thing I hate more than those screaming glaciers are the screams of tourists. I used to see them all the time when I was a kid. They were strange little friends that I imagined anytime we were riding in the car. At least, I thought they were my friends. I wish I still thought they were. I grew up in a military family. My mom, my dad, and me, until I was about 10 years old. Dad was a helicopter mechanic with the Navy, and Mom was a communications expert, also with the Navy. They had met some years ago at the base they were stationed at, and we had lived on bases for most of my life. Base housing isn't terrible, but it's hard to build a life when you're constantly getting shuffled around. We went from California to Texas to Mississippi to Georgia to Florida to Tennessee to Virginia, and eventually we went all the way back to Mississippi. I remember being bored as we drove. Not a lot to do when you're on the road for that many hours. I had books and toys, and at one point I even had a Game Boy that my dad had bought me. But I still managed to get bored as the scenery rolled past, and I was left sitting in the back seat. I was 5 the first time I came up with the game. I called them the run-alongs. They were these sleek black dog things that would run along beside the car while we were driving. They had long legs, and their bodies were kind of oozy and oily. They would run along outside the car as we drove, and I would watch them as they jumped over bushes or went through trees. I would sit and watch them for hours as they followed the car, but my parents never seemed to see them. I would draw pictures of them sometimes, making them as detailed as I could, but they would always just laugh and say I was so creative. If the drawings freaked them out, then they never showed. They probably just thought I was a kid with an overactive imagination, and went about their day without thinking too much about it. Things didn't get weird, though, until our last move. They offered Dad a job in Mississippi. He'd be working on jet planes, and the pay was more than worth the move. Dad agreed, but he had one stipulation. He had about 10 more years until he could officially retire from the Navy, and he wanted to spend those 10 years in the same place. He wanted a contract that would stipulate that, unless it was a time of war or a state of emergency, my dad was never to be transferred away from his new base again. The top brass agreed. Dad had enough rank and time that he could ask these sorts of things, and they signed paperwork and told him to enjoy his stay in Mississippi. We packed up for what Dad promised would be the last time, and we made our way to our new home. My favorite game was still making up adventures for the come-alongs. I had them follow us through fields that we were driving past, jumping over cows and fences as they followed the car. I smiled as one of them stopped to jump over a sleepy sheepdog, and then the dog barked and started running after him. I thought it was just something my imagination was doing. Like I said, the creatures had always been something I believe just existed in my mind. Anything that they actually did was just something that I had come up with, and they weren't real enough to interact with anything out there. Not really. The sheepdog chased them until they came to a fence, and once they got over it, he seemed to be content and go away. The come-alongs kept following us, looking at the car every now and again to see where we were going as they ran endlessly to catch up to us. We drove for about 8 hours that day, and when we stopped for the night, I noticed that the creatures didn't just go away like they usually did. I remember reaching into the car to get my bag and looking across the street to the empty field across from the motel. The come-alongs were sitting in the field and watching me, their tongues hanging out and their eyes focused directly on what I was doing. They seemed confused when I went inside, clearly not something they had expected, but they didn't stay in the field either. My parents gave me the bed across from the window, and I remember waking up a few times as something scratched at the glass and made strange noises in the middle of the night. I'd open my eyes a little bit, and I would see the shadow of the canines as they sat outside the window and seemed to call to me to come on. I told them to go away as quietly as I could a few times, but after a while, I hunkered under the blankets and covers, shaking as I wished they would go away. They were starting to scare me, and this was something they had never done before. Usually once the car ride was over, they would just go away. and when the sun came up and I crawled out of bed, I remember being relieved that they had left. We got something to eat, but as we pulled back onto the interstate, I remembered hearing a weird dog-like noise and turning my head to see that they were following the car again. Where had they been all morning? Maybe I was only just now thinking about them, so they had appeared. Whatever the case, they continued to follow us as they jumped over trees and fences and even a couple of buildings. Usually the creatures were a ways back, not really within barking distance of the car. Today, however, they were pretty close, within about 50 feet of the car at least. They would move away a little bit, but they always seemed to gravitate closer as the day pressed on, the sun beginning to sink again. I asked Dad if we were going to stop tonight, and he shook his head and said he was going to drive right on through so they could make it in time. I remembered being relieved because I didn't want to listen to the come-alongs scratching at the window again. I looked at them and put my tongue out, letting them know that we wouldn't be stopping so they couldn't scare me again tonight. We were out in the pretty rural end of the country by this point, streetlights being few and far between, and I could see them moving over sidewalks and through fields as they followed us. I would catch sight of them in the pools of light cast by the few small street lamps along the highway. The moon was a little more than a sliver tonight, and it wasn't casting a lot of light for me to see much of anything out there. They were like shadows as they moved across the ground, and the longer I watched them, the more terrified I became. They were following us, and I wondered what would happen if they followed us all the way to our new home. Would they stay there and wait for one of us to come outside? Would they get us when we got out of the car? I didn't know, but I knew we were going to be living on a military base again, so I hoped maybe the guards at the gate would stop them if they kept following us. My mom had fallen asleep, and my dad was drinking energy drinks as he tried to keep his eyes open. I didn't understand how Mom could sleep. I was keeping both eyes on the creatures as they ran, and I'd begun to notice that they were getting closer and closer to the car. They were about 20 feet away from us at any given time now, and when one of them jumped a fence and ran onto the sidewalk beside the vehicle, I began to wonder what they were planning to do. When he slammed into the side of the car and made Dad swerve, I heard Dad say a cuss word as his energy drink slipped out of his hand. He bent down and tried to get it, but when the dog hit the car again, Dad jerked upright and turned to look. Damn, the wind is pretty fierce out there tonight. I didn't understand. Couldn't he see them? They were banging on the side of the car, but he was acting like it was nothing more than a stiff wind. He sped up a little bit, clearly not sure what was going on, and the come-alongs were having a really hard time keeping up with us. If we had passed a cop, Dad would have probably been pulled over, but there weren't a lot of patrol officers out that night, and as we came around the bend, I saw a sign that made my heart skip a beat. Naval Construction Battalion Center, 15 miles. We were almost to the military base. Once we got there, we'd be safe. Dad had always said that the military bases were the safest place in the world, and that nothing could get us once we were there. I kept looking at the beasts as they followed us, but they seemed to be getting tired now. Well, two of them were getting tired. The one that I thought of as the lead come along was still keeping pace with the car. He had a big gash on his shoulder, and I realized he was probably the one that had been ramming our car. He banged into us again, and Dad nearly went into a spin as Mom woke up and asked what was going on. Dad told her he thought he had hit a pothole or something, and as I looked back at the come-along that was trying to knock us off the road, I saw that it had fallen over on the sidewalk and was panting like it was out of breath. Its eyes never left me as we drove on, and I didn't know what to make of the look that stretched across its face. It wasn't anger. It wasn't some kind of blind rage. In fact, it looked like disappointment. I honestly think that the creatures had just wanted to play, and the fact that I wouldn't get out of the car was a kind of betrayal for them. As we passed another sign telling us that the base was coming up and there would be a checkpoint ahead, I remember feeling a little bit sad that they might think that I didn't want to play anymore and that we weren't friends. I had only to take a look at the dent in the side of the car when we finally got to our new house, though, to show me that maybe they weren't the sort of friends that I wanted. The Navy was true to its word. Dad stayed there until he finally retired when I was 20. I was in college by then, thinking about going into the Navy myself, and I hadn't seen the come-alongs at all since the last move. Maybe they were just a figment of my imagination, or maybe they really were some kind of weird creature that had decided to come along with us anytime we traveled. But anytime I think they might have been make-believe, I have only to remember that big dent in the side of Dad's car. He never explained how he got it, and I think it spooked him just a little bit. So if you see them, just remember that some of their games aren't fun. Just remember that when you see the come-alongs, the games may turn deadly all too soon. The auditorium buzzed with interest as people in suits sat around like expectant insects. On the stage, there was a large, grand piano, and as the lights went down, I heard the unsteady footsteps of my grandfather's leather shoes. He had worn them for the better part of 60 years, and I'd asked him once why he took them to get them repaired instead of just getting a new pair. He had laughed and pointed at the dangling soles before telling me that when you had shoes that were this broken in and this comfortable, you didn't just throw them in the garbage can. It wasn't as if Gramps couldn't have afforded a new pair of shoes. Gramps had always lived pretty comfortably. He was a concert pianist. He had been since he was in high school, and he played the sort of music that made people cry and that made people come to the ballet or the opera to hear it. He did concerts as well, though not for people my age. It was for the stiff shirt crowd that usually showed up to things like that. He was well respected in his field, and the house was packed to the rafters for one reason and one reason only. Tonight was going to be his final performance, and people were expecting something amazing. Excuse me, coming through. I looked up to see an older guy in an immaculate tuxedo coming down the aisle as he excused himself. He had that artless way that some older men had about them, of looking charming and debonair without even trying. His cheekbones were high, and his hair was immaculate. I don't usually look at men that way, but even I had to admit he was very handsome. He excused himself and sat in the seat beside me, a seat that my grandfather had reserved for someone he called the patron. The old man took the seat and adjusted his tie, checking his watch as he listened to my grandfather's squeaky shoes walk towards the piano bench. This better be good. I've sunk a lot of time into this old fella. I wanted to tell him to button up and show a little respect, but Grandpa was having a seat in front of the piano and cracking his fingers before he began to play. For a man in his 80s, Grandpa played like he was in the prime of life. His fingers flew over the keys, his hands were nimble as they had ever been, and he would play anything that he set his mind to, with minimal practice. He was a genius, a prodigy, and I hoped that one day I would be even a third as good a pianist as he was. He ran through a few of his early works, a few songs written by great performers, and I heard the crowd making appreciative noises around me. Grandpa never failed to captivate a crowd, but as the performance went on, I became aware of one person who was far from enthralled. The man who sat beside me was fidgeting, checking his watch and sighing as Grandpa played on. It was hard to ignore him from less than a foot away, and as he shifted his legs, I started getting agitated. Who was this old man? Who was he to talk so about my grandpa? Who was he to say that his nimble fingers and easy performances weren't the works of art that they had always been? I can't believe I came all the way here just to see this. The old man promised to move me, but I am far from moved. It's nothing I haven't heard before. The old man should damn well know it. "Hey," I finally said, having had enough of it, "why don't you pipe down? Grandpa's up there pouring his heart out. I can't believe that someone would sit here and say such things about him." The old man looked at me as if he had never been spoken to in such a way. As the smile began to creep across his face, "Oh, so Jamie Masterson is your grandfather, is he?" "He is, and you would do well to show him some respect. He's one of the greatest concert pianists of our age. If you aren't moved by his music, then that says more about you than it does about my grandfather." As Grandpa played on, the old man seemed more interested in me than the music going on ahead of us. "My apologies," the old man said. "It's just that I've heard it all before. I've been listening to your grandpa for a very, very long time. You could say that I'm the one who gave him his start." I rolled my eyes. "Well then, you'd have to be sure to publish your skincare routine, because you don't look a day over 45. I find it difficult to believe that you were already established over 60 years ago." "Son, I've been established a lot longer than that. Has your grandfather never spoken of me? If he did, then he must have spoken wrongly. My grandfather had never told me of someone so rude. I was there when your grandfather played his first note of music. I was there when his fingers first touched the piano. I watched him play, and I was jealous. I too am a musician, but I could never play the way your grandfather did. Alas, my lot in life is to guide those to what they cannot find themselves. Your grandfather had talent, but he would have never survived in a world such as the one he lived in. Talent was not appreciated like it is now, and your grandfather needed a little help. I provided that help. I provided him with connections and confidence and helped him be the man he is today." I took it all in silence, deciding that the guy was a nut. I turned my attention to Grandpa, ignoring him as he rambled on. He talked about helping people and making deals, and I was about to tell him to be quiet when he said something that made me forget Grandpa's playing for a moment. "All it cost your grandfather is his soul, and I'd say he's got a pretty good deal for it." That got my attention. I turned my head back to the man, and as he grinned at me in the low light, I became aware of something just beneath the surface. Perhaps it was some monstrous aspect or just a trick of the light, but his was a face that was used to being seen in low light. Are you claiming to be?" But he cut me off. "I'm not claiming to be anything. I am what I am, and I am the one who holds your grandfather's soul. I would say that bringing joy to people for the last 60 years is something that he would consider a fair trade, but his deal isn't quite over yet. Your grandfather wanted something at the end of his life, and I'm here to see if he can make good on it." I still didn't believe him. Who would believe him? But I was intrigued now, and as Grandpa's song began to come to an end, I asked him the question he clearly wanted me to voice. What is it that Grandpa wanted exactly? His smile was predatory, the kind of smile that told me he was hoping maybe the two of us could make a deal once Grandpa's concert was over. "Your grandfather agreed to trade me his soul for success and the proliferation of his talent. But he put in one stipulation. He told me that at the end of his life, he would play one song for me. He said he would write, compose, and play a song so beautiful that it would make an angel, even a fallen angel, weep for joy. He told me he would show me the face of God in a song, and that if I was brought to tears and moved by such a piece, I was to give him his soul back and proclaim him the greatest musician this world has ever known. I was speechless. I still didn't believe the man, but I found that I wanted to. My grandfather had always been so sharp, so renowned, and it wasn't hard to imagine that he had made a deal in his youth to gain such talent. This man was sitting here claiming to be that deal maker, and as the song ended and Grandpa basked in the applause, he slowly got to his feet and looked out over the audience. "Thank you for coming to my final concert. I have one more piece to play for you. It's something I've written for someone very special. He's here tonight. I want you all to thank my very mysterious benefactor and let him know exactly what you think of his song at the end of the concert. I hope he will find the time and energy he has invested in me to be an investment well made." "We shall see," the man beside me said, as the applause thundered around him. Grandpa took his seat behind the piano, and he began playing something halting and low. It grew in volume and majesty, soaring across the keys like a magnificent bird as it wafted around the auditorium. Grandpa's piece was strange, speeding up and slowing down and then speeding up again. It never rambled. It always challenged the note before it and found itself better. It was unlike anything I had ever heard before, and I reached up to touch my face and found moisture running down my cheeks. I could see people crying before he had gotten very far. Their faces were set in something rapturous, and they seemed unable to process what they were hearing fully. I saw people putting their hands to their faces, people's eyes getting wide enough that they might fall out of their heads, and even a few of them had risen to their feet so they could stand and watch him. I couldn't blame them. I felt like getting up as well. Some of them had already begun to clap, and others were joining them. They were clapping, a standing ovation that crashed over everything like a curled fist. If Grandpa heard them, then it never showed. He played on and on as if only the music mattered to him. I saw sweat running down his face, his hair sticking up crazily, and he looked for all the world like a cartoon character as his undershirt came untucked and stuck out with the fury of his playing. The whole song lasted 6 of the most glorious minutes of my life, but soon I found myself looking at the professed devil instead of at my grandfather as he played his heart out. The man's face had been a mask of contempt, a glamour of self-indulgence. But as the song went on, I saw that mask begin to crack. His mouth began to slip open, his eyes crinkling around the corners, and before the midpoint, his hands had risen to his face, and he was openly weeping. He didn't begin to clap, and he didn't have a rapturous experience, but he looked as if whatever he was hearing my grandfather play had moved him so deeply that he might never be the same again. When he cried, his tears were thick and red. It was as if he were crying blood, and it stained the front of his tuxedo like a toddler with pasta sauce. For just a moment, I saw the glamour break around him, and I beheld a face that very few had ever seen truly. It was not the face of Satan, but the face of Lucifer, the morning star, that shining being that once stood before God himself. In those moments, he was somehow reborn. He was transformed by my grandfather's song, and as it ended and the applause continued to thunder around us, I saw the change go over him again as he returned to nothing but an old man sitting in the theater. They applauded for nearly 10 minutes. The thunderous waves crackled and exploded around us. and my grandfather rose as his song ended and began to bow for those who had come to hear him play his last. They loved him, and there wasn't a dry eye in the house. The man wiped the blood from his face, and I saw the stains on his tuxedo melt away to nothing as he, too, began to slowly clap his hands. "Exquisite," he breathed, his voice the exclamation of an orgasm. "Tell your grandfather that he has earned his soul back. Tell him that his song has done the impossible, and that it has done what I believed could never be done again. Tell him that I do not consider the time I spent on him wasted. Tell him that the magic was always in him, and that I only helped others to see it. He is truly the greatest composer of this and many other generations, and I was happy to be called his patron." Then he handed me something, a small leather book, and he took his leave as the applause continued. My grandfather hugged me after the concert was over and asked if the old man had said anything to me. He had made a beeline for me straight away, diverting several well-wishers and benefactors of the arts who had come to speak with him to get to my side. He was smiling, but you could see the concern in his eyes as he asked if the old devil had said anything. I said nothing. I just handed him the book, but his face told me all I needed to know. He lived to be 100, living another 20 years after his final concert, before dying peacefully in his bed one night. He never played again. He never even touched a piano after that night. And people still talk about that concert in my hometown to this very day. My grandfather was a legend for so many reasons, but I think I might be the only one besides him who knows the truth behind it. He made a deal with the devil and then fulfilled his bargain so fully that the devil was forced to give him back what he had taken. Few have ever done such, few that I know of, but Grandpa truly was a master of his craft. Her name was Janice, and I'll never forget her. We met one night at this dive bar that I used to frequent. Dusty's was barely even stable enough to be called a bar, but the drinks were cheap and the music was pretty good, and it was in the right part of town for a broke college kid like me to get a few beers in after class. They had a pretty shaky ID policy, and the bartender never looked twice at my clearly doctored ID. I wouldn't be 21 for another year when I started drinking there, and he didn't seem to mind. I got the feeling that if it wasn't for drunk college kids with fake IDs, the bar probably wouldn't be able to stay open. So the owner hid under the plausible deniability of our poorly constructed glamour. I had been drinking for about the last 6 months when I saw her. Most of Dusty's crowd was college kids with ramen stains on their shirts, winos from the alley behind the bar, and the odd junkie or guy looking to sell a bag of something to somebody else. We didn't get a lot of fights there, but it was definitely not the pinnacle of Western civilization. She stood out like a neon tube in a school fluorescent. She was wearing a purple sequin jacket with something a lighter shade of purple underneath it. She had on what could have been charitably called a skirt, but it was probably more similar to a tutu. She had on socks that went up to her knees, and a pair of Doc Martens that looked like they'd kick your teeth in if you made her mad. She was sitting at the bar, and she was smoking a cigarette, and as I came in, I watched the ash fall into her glass and slowly drowned. She didn't seem to care. She finished the drink and then started patting her pockets for another cigarette. Before she could find her smokes, I reached into my own pocket and fished out a pack of Marlboro Reds and offered her one. She looked at the pack and grinned before reaching out to take one, and began the shakedown dance again so she could find a lighter. Her face illuminated oddly when I brought out my own lighter, and she smiled as she leaned towards the flame. A gentleman, and a gentleman who's prepared as well. My name is Janus. What's yours? I told her my name was Bert, and we spent the rest of the night talking. I usually only stayed in Dusty's until I was drunk enough to stumble back to my dorm room and pass out, but when the old man called last call around 3 a.m., I realized I'd been there for several hours. I didn't mind. I'd been having fun talking to her. As we kept drinking, the subject matter became a little hazy, but that was okay too. It was all right. Everything was all right, and her sparkly jacket seemed to glimmer under the harsh fluorescence of the bar as the alcohol made halos around the rhinestones. "Looks like this wound's about to close," she said with a laugh as she put her glass down and tossed some money on the bar. "You heading out, or are you feeling like maybe drinking a little more?" I don't get a lot of play from women. My body type is similar to that of a potato, but I knew a come-on when I heard one. I told her I'd be glad to do a little more drinking, and she took me by the hand and led me towards the back of the bar where the bathrooms were. I was hesitant, not wanting to get banned from Dusty's for getting up to a little hanky-panky in a bathroom stall, but when I tried to pull away, her grip became firm, and she told me to trust her. I didn't really see many options as we came to the door of the women's room. She looked around conspiratorially, and then turned back to me. "Do you know something cool about the universe, Bert?" I shook my head slowly. "It's something I discovered when I was very young. Something that's taken me places all my life. I don't know if it's like this for you," she said as she reached back and rapped her knuckles 3 times on the door. "But for me, the one cosmic truth has always been this. If you knock on it, it becomes a door." I laughed. I thought she was drunker than I was, but then my laugh became a gasp as she opened the door, and I saw a sea of glowing tubes and heard music that wouldn't be popular for another 10 years at this point. I saw smoke and heard a beat that seemed to move through my bones. People had turned to look at the disturbance, and then she pulled me through the door and let it close behind her. Suddenly, we were in a strange place that was so alien, it might as well be on another planet. That was the first time I stepped through one of those doors, but it wouldn't be the last. I would come to discover that she had taken me to what was called a rave. There was a man on a podium with a computer that was much smaller than the one I had back in my dorm room. It was pumping out music that I could feel in my fillings, and the people on the floor were dancing in a way that made me think they might be on drugs. She pushed through them and went to the bar, Janus getting me something to drink as I took it all in. I met Janus in 1992, and at that point, this was just about the weirdest thing I had ever seen. "How do you do that?" I asked, having to shout over the music. "I don't know," she said with a little shrug. "It's just something I've always been able to do. For my whole life, anytime I needed to go somewhere, I would just knock and it would take me somewhere else. I don't know if I'm a time traveler or it's just another dimension. I don't even know if we're on the same planet or not, but I know it's fun, and I'll probably keep doing it till I die." We danced a little, or did what amounted to dancing in this place, but after a while, we went off somewhere quieter and started talking. Janus told me that she had been traveling like this since she was about 6 years old. She might have been traveling longer than that. She couldn't remember, but 6 years old was when she had started time traveling for real. My parents had sent me to bed without supper because of something I had said to a teacher. I told my teacher that blue whales were not the biggest animal in the ocean, and she laughed at me and told me I was wrong. She stopped laughing when I told her that she was wrong, like she knew what was in the ocean. Anyway, so my parents sent me to bed without supper, and I decided that If they weren't going to feed me, then I would feed myself. So I knocked on my closet door and went into this strange back alley place so that I could try to find some food. I didn't have any control over where the doors open. That's one of the major problems with knocking. I could travel, but I never know where it's going to bring me out. Back then, I just explored wherever it took me, thinking that nothing would hurt me in that way that children always do. It was an adventure, and I would come out on the other side in the same shape that I always had, just like the kids in the fantasy stories that I read. It didn't happen like that this time. Some people got a hold of me and tried to sell me to some other people as slave labor or something. Apparently, I'd come out in some sort of Dickensian version of the United States, and I was just some orphan girl in weird clothes. It took me a while, but I managed to get away from them and started knocking on doors as I tried to get back. Sometimes, if I knocked on the same door or near the place that I had come out through, I could go back to the place that I had come from. It took me some time to get back to that exact alley, but when I knocked on the wall, it turned into a door, and I stepped out through my closet. She took a long drag off her cigarette as she let the music in the warehouse behind us thump through her body, clearly trying to find the words for what came next. The problem is, time works different on that side of things. I hadn't been gone for a couple of days or a week or two, like I had over there. I'd been missing for 2 years. I came back to discover that the room that had once been mine wasn't mine anymore. Nobody lived in my house, and everything was dark and cold. Some of my clothes were still there, and I put them in a backpack and started exploring what was left. My parents were gone. Whether they'd moved or died or whatever, I didn't know. There was nobody there to greet me, and the house was abandoned, so I decided to knock on another door and move again. After that, I just kept moving, just kept knocking, just kept living. I stole things when I needed to, I worked when I needed to, and mostly I just kept traveling. I don't even know if the version of my parents' house that I came out on was mine or not, but I didn't care. I'd seen things in my time in that city that had made me very afraid, and I knew now that what I saw on the other side of the doors could hurt me. I didn't want to be hurt anymore, so I just kept moving. That's a rough way to live, especially for a little kid, I said lamely as I watched my own cigarette burn down in my hand. I wasn't even smoking it anymore. The conversation had stolen my attendance, and when it fell to the ground, I didn't even pick it up. Yeah, I guess so. It was just life for me. I've been traveling ever since, seeing everything and doing whatever. It's lonely out there sometimes. I take people with me on occasions, and eventually I drop them off somewhere else, and they go about their own sort of lives. Nobody stays for long. Most people don't want to travel aimlessly forever, but it's all I've ever known. We stood in silence for a moment, me trying to find something to say, and her clearly weighing her next words. I like you, Bert. You seem like a fun guy. Would you like to travel with me for a while? I can't promise that it'll always be comfortable, but it will be interesting. You look like you could use a little interesting in your life. I started to say yes. Absolutely no hesitation, but my better judgment got the better of me. My life wasn't perfect. I was swimming in college debt, and my classes were slowly circling the drain. But I only had about 6 months of my degree left before I might be able to have something worthwhile. That something worthwhile was probably just a job that would help me pay off my student loans, but it was something. I couldn't just up and abandon everything. My dad had died when I was in high school, but my mom had been trying her best to help me when she could. She would be distraught if I just suddenly vanished, and I couldn't do that to her. Tell you what, you keep coming back to Dusty's, and I'll keep showing up for adventures. Is that an option? She laughed, and then she leaned in to kiss me, and her mouth tasted like cigarettes and a strange miasma of alcohols. Tasted like something else, too, however. It tasted foreign, like she'd eaten meals that I didn't have names for, like she'd drunk water from streams in places that I had never seen and would never see, and something else below the surface that I couldn't place at the time. Janus tasted like freedom. Tell you what, I'll keep hanging around Dusty's for a couple of months. If you change your mind and you want to come with me when I decide to tumbleweed out of here, I'll take you with me. Fair warning, if you stop seeing me for a while, then it probably means I've moved on. I don't stay in any place more than a couple of months, and that's just the way I like it. She took me back to the spot we'd come out of, and when we stepped back through, I saw the bartender look up and shake his head at me. "What are you, some kind of magician? I swear I just checked that bathroom." "Well, you're pretty lucky. I was just about to close up and go home. Get out of here. I'm sure I'll see you back tonight." I turned around, but Janus didn't come with me. The door had just become a regular bathroom door again, and I walked back to my dorm room with my head buzzing. I'd seen more in that night than I'd seen in my 3 years of college, and I found that I wanted to see more. I'd never even been out of my hometown, and as I settled in for bed, I thought that a little traveling might be the best thing for me. It would need to come after, though. I needed to be done with this part of my life first, and then we could see what would come after. I didn't see Janus at Dusty's every night, but I saw her there regularly. We didn't wait till last call after the first night. She would take me by the hand and lead me to a door, sometimes through the bathroom and sometimes through the door at the back of the room, and then she would take me to these wonderful and sometimes terrifying places. Sometimes we would go to parties, and sometimes we would just explore fantastical places, but our trips were never boring. We danced beneath 4 moons in a forest that looked as alien as the bottom of an ocean must. We drank unnamed cocktails in a monochrome bar full of slug people. We skied down snow as pristine as porcelain on a planet that never got below 80 degrees. We danced to music that you didn't hear with your ears, but you felt in every other sense in your body. We also hid from creatures made entirely of shadow, were hunted through the woods by strange, deformed canines, got yelled at by creatures whose language was completely unintelligible, and stood in a room full of mirror versions of ourselves who were slightly different or slightly worse. In those 6 months, I saw more things than I could describe, did more things than I could ever even begin to talk about, and felt free for the first time in a long time. Something else happened that I hadn't expected either. Janus and I started to grow closer. It started with her grabbing my hand and holding my fingers tight, but eventually it became something else. It was an arm thrown over my shoulder. It was her head against my chest as we danced. It was her lips on mine under the stars. It was her eyes when she would look at me as we stood together. Sometimes she would throw herself at me without warning, and for a guy who had been in the middle of a 2-year dry spell, I suddenly had a rather active sex life. I don't know when I decided that I loved her, but I believe she felt the same. It was so obvious that she had feelings for me as well, but I suppose it was only obvious to me. Something else happened that I hadn't expected. Somehow, as I traveled to strange places and saw wondrous things, I found my grades increasing and my desire to finish school refreshed. I seemed to have a new lease on life, and suddenly I wasn't content to get drunk and stumble home and fall into unconsciousness. I wanted more than my single existence, and I decided that I didn't want to simply be dropped somewhere when she grew tired of me. I wanted to see it all. And more than that, I wanted to see it all with her. After a few months, it was time to graduate and see all my efforts rewarded. I invited Janice to my graduation. She laughed at me and said that of course she'd be there. My mom would be there, so would my siblings, and they looked at the strangely dressed woman as she waved and screamed my name from the bleachers. She hugged me and stood for photos as I stood in my cap and gown, and afterwards she took me out to celebrate. She took me to a cliffside that overlooked an oddly purple ocean as it lapped against the rocks behind us. She had set up a sort of picnic, and as she pulled it out of her bag and laid it on the ground, she patted a pillow and invited me to come sit with her. I had a little more than celebrating on my mind that night. I was going to ask Janice to stay with me. I was going to offer to go with her, to travel with her, and I'd already asked Mom if I could have the ring that Dad had given her. I know how stupid that sounds. 6 months is absolutely no time to have known someone. But when I was with Janice, everything felt right. We drank and ate and talked about life and discussed what we would do next. And that's when I approached the subject. I think I'm ready to go with you. Janice squealed and threw her arms around me, spilling champagne down my back as she did so. Oh my gosh, yes! I'm so happy to hear that, Bert. You won't regret it. We're gonna have a blast. There's something I want to ask you before we go, though. Something I want to know. She laughed and looked at me as if she thought I was going to ask her what I needed to pack or if I was ever going to come back. When I pulled the ring out, it seemed to be the last thing that she had expected. I don't want to be your temporary companion, Janice. I want to be with you forever. I want to travel forever with you. Will you marry me? I'd expected joy or tears or astonishment, but I wasn't prepared when she began to back away from me. She looked confused, like she couldn't understand what I was asking. Her hands were still by her mouth, but she looked unsure instead of speechless. When I reached out for her, wanting to comfort her through whatever this was, she pulled away from me and shook her head. Janice, what's wrong? I'm ready to go with you. I want to travel with you. Forever. The tears were really coming down now, and as she reached out for the ring, her hands shook. Bert, I want to say yes, but I'm just not sure. She struggled with words and finally came up with, I care for you very deeply, but everyone I get close to ultimately leaves. She closed her eyes and shook her head slowly as she tried to make sense of it. I need to think about this. Can I think about it? Can I give you an answer tomorrow night? I nodded, not having much else to do, and as she took me back to the bar and left me at the door to the storage room, her kiss felt heated and uncertain. Worse, it felt conflicted, and as I walked home, I hoped I would see her tomorrow. Whether the answer was yes or no, I just wanted to see her again. I came back the next day, but Janice was nowhere to be found. I came back the next night, but she was still nowhere to be seen. I came back every night for 2 weeks. I came back until college left a notice that it was time to vacate my dorm room, but I never saw Janice again. I drove from my house to the bar a few times, but she was never there. I found myself feeling lost after that. I just drifted for a while, nothing really mattering, but my mind was never far from Janice. I didn't know if she had rejected my proposal or if something had happened to her, but after 3 months of wondering, I made a decision that would change my life. I took the money my family had given me after graduation. I closed out my bank account. I packed some clothes in a backpack, and I just left. I headed out into the world with no plans, no destination, and only one idea in my head. I would look for her until I found her, or until the day I die. That was years ago. I've been out of college for decades, but I still find myself visiting bars and looking for Janus. I sit in the back and scan the crowd. Sometimes I drink, sometimes I don't. But when it's closing time, I always move on. In my own way, I'm traveling, just like her. I've made my way to the West Coast twice now, and when I do, I turn around and walk back. When I need money, I do day labor or handyman work. When I'm tired, I find somewhere out of the way to sleep. When I find someone willing to give me a ride, I take it. When I find a bar, I stop and stay until last call. I'm older now, no longer the bright-eyed kid I was for the 8 months that we knew each other. She probably wouldn't even recognize me anymore. I don't care. I don't care if she rejects me. I don't care if she hates me. I just want to see her one more time and ask her why she never came back. If I die before I see her again, then maybe I'll get my answers sooner rather than later. Until then, I'll keep traveling. I'll keep looking. I'll keep seeking the doors. I've never been what you'd call a successful man. I was a loser in high school, more interested in smoking pot and drinking at parties than studying. I was a solid C student, and it ensured that any college I went to would want a huge payment for me to attend. Without the prospects of higher learning, I went looking for a trade instead. Trade school was a little more reasonable, and a good thing too, because I went on a tour of their course catalog. I spent a semester here, a semester there, learning welding, nursing assistants, AC repair, computer science, and about a dozen other things before my parents cut me off. I would only last a couple of months before changing to something else, and finally, they had enough of it. My parents had been patient with me, way more than they should have been, but after 4 years of trade school, they'd had enough. They put me out of their house, told me I needed to make my own way. Gave me a few $100s to keep me off the street. It didn't work. I still slept rough for a few nights, couch surfed for a few more, but eventually I got a job at a gas station and managed to afford a 1-bedroom apartment in a sketchy part of town. It's not great. I have to change the locks pretty often since people keep kicking my door in, but it's home. The home invasion would probably bother me if I had anything worth stealing, but I don't. The only thing I have that's worth a damn is my laptop, and I take it everywhere with me. My TV is too old to pawn, my collectibles are all sentimental, and even my furniture is secondhand, maybe even third-hand. Life isn't great, but suppose it could be worse. Apparently, it could be a lot worse. I was off one night, lying in a stupor of drugs and alcohol as I tried to quiet my mind so I could fall asleep, when I heard the new lock on my front door burst inward, as someone gave it a stiff kick. Even in my current state, I knew I was in danger. This was going to be bad if they found me back here. I was in no position to defend myself. I wasn't even in a position to call for help. Whatever had been in the skag I'd bought from a pal of mine was probably laced with something harder than I had wanted, and it laid me out like a bug on a glue board. I expected to hear them dragging things out of the cabinets or commenting on my crappy electronics, but they were making a beeline for my bedroom, as if they were looking for something specific. I could hear them coming closer, and no matter how hard I tried to move, I couldn't make my body obey me. It was as if I was floating on a cloud, and none of my systems wanted to operate correctly. I remember kicking myself for not hiding my laptop, and I knew that if they came in, they were going to take it when they saw it just sitting on the desk. It's hard to explain that feeling if you've never felt it, but it's one of the worst experiences I've ever had. When they opened the door to my bedroom, I felt absolutely defenseless for the first time in my life. I knew there was a chance they would kill me, but Felt certain that they'd probably leave me alone once they realized I couldn't get up or do anything about their invasion. The door opened, and I heard them talking in low voices as they walked in. One of them called me by name, and the other one said that it had to be me before he reached down and lifted me onto his shoulder. I expected they would ransack the room, but they didn't. The three of them walked out with me, and as they went into the elevator that would take them to the ground floor, I realized that no one had tried to stop them. People who live in my neighborhood usually mind their own business pretty well, but come on. You expect that some of them will say something when they realize that someone is being abducted. From my vantage point on my abductor's shoulder, I couldn't really see anything except his back. There were two others in the elevator, but they were standing in front of me, so all I could really see was the back of his pants, and all I could really hear was their voices. They seemed to be discussing me as if I was some kind of commodity, and it made me wonder if being killed was the worst thing they could do to me. Was this some kind of sex trafficking thing? Was I going to have my organs harvested, or were they going to try to ransom me back to my family? Good luck with that second one. I hadn't even spoken to my family for close to 4 years, and I doubted they were going to pay money for me. I expected that maybe someone would ask them what they thought they were doing as the elevator doors opened, and they walked out the front door, but no one did. They just walked up to a van and sat me on one of the seats in the middle row. I got a good look at them then, and two of them looked pretty rough. One of them was bald, but his face was a patchwork of scars and old wounds that hadn't quite healed. The other one looked like he might have stopped smoking meth and went on to chewing it. His skin was a craggy mess, and his gray hair was long and stringy. The third looked the most normal, though he was missing an eye, and his face was still lined with scars. He had his hair cut short in a military fashion, and the way he moved made me think that one of his legs might be prosthetic. As he sat, I began to think the arm on his left side was also fake. He sat beside me in the van, and one of them slid something over my face. It was a black mesh bag, and the inside smelled like spit and sweat. They buckled me in, and then the one with the prosthetic limbs told them to go. I couldn't see as we drove, but I could hear, and hearing was bad enough. "Look at him. He's off his gourd." "He should be," said the one sitting right beside me. "I paid Dwayne extra to give him the stuff that we laced." Dwayne. That made me feel sick to my stomach. Dwayne had been my regular dealer for years. We'd known each other in high school, and it was a relationship that had lasted into my adult years. Dwayne had good stuff, and his prices for locals were usually pretty reasonable. The idea that Dwayne would have screwed me over was not something I really wanted to think about, but I guess I would have to. "At least he still has a Dwayne," one of them said, and the comment didn't make a lot of sense until later. "I lost mine back when that meth fire happened." "Did you see his apartment? He's got all that, yet he still sees the need to get high. What kind of demons does this guy have to fight? What kind of problems could be so bad?" The conversation was pretty weird, but it wasn't as weird as the feeling of having my arm lifted by the guy sitting next to me. He'd lifted the sleeve and was moving my arm by the wrist as he inspected it. I don't know why, but it felt like he was assessing merchandise, and it made me wonder again if this was some kind of black market organ harvest. Surely they couldn't take my arm off and put it onto someone else. Could they? I wasn't up on that kind of thing, not as much as I should be, but it didn't seem like something they'd be able to do. If it's never happened to you, then it's probably impossible to explain, but that feeling of helplessness was something that I just couldn't shake. Maybe it was the drugs, but I think it was just being unable to move while these people did whatever they wanted to me. Luckily, the things they wanted to do were mostly take me somewhere else and weirdly inspect my arm, but I realize now that it could have been a lot worse. I was like a puppet, completely at their mercy, and whether they realized it or not, it was my own personal hell. We pulled up somewhere, and they took me out of the van with one under each arm. My feet had begun to kick weakly at that point, my fingers wiggling just a little bit, but I was still basically a rag doll. They took me inside, and the sound of nightlife between the van and the front door made me think we might be near the area where I usually met Dwayne. It was the kind of place where you heard sirens and gunshots and people yelling at all hours of the night, and the kind of place where screeching tires might signify the end of your life. It was not the sort of place I particularly wanted to be after dark, and if they'd brought me here, then there was no telling what was to follow. They brought me inside, sat me down, and then duct taped my hands to a metal chair. I still had the black bag on, so I wasn't sure where we were, and as it came off, I could see we were in some kind of warehouse. It was empty, not the sort of place where you'd have to trip over stored things, and I was sitting in the center of a pool of light as over a dozen people gathered around the outskirts. I was glare blind, and I couldn't see any of the people standing outside the light. They were barely defined figures, human approximations made out of shadow, and as one of them came forward, I could hear the oddly metallic sound of a prosthetic foot hitting the ground. As he came into the light, I could see it was the man with the military haircut, the one that had looked so familiar. And as he came right up to me, I realized why he looked familiar. He was me, just with more scars and a less messy haircut. He looked at me appraisingly, turning my head this way and that with his good hand, and I could see old bullet holes and the scars of hot metal that had left his cheek a ruin. One of his eyes was white, the dead look that you usually got when it had been damaged beyond repair, but the other one was bright and working. He looked at me the way people look at art, the way people look at a plasma screen TV on the wall at Walmart, the way people look at things that they want, but they know they can't afford. He turned my face to look at his, and when he did, he smiled, and I could see that he was missing quite a few teeth. Well, look at you, the cream of the crop, the one who was spared. We've been looking for you for quite some time, me and my friends here. Looks like we finally found you. Your friends? I managed to slur out. He looked back at the light and invited a few of them to come forward. They still seemed hesitant, not really sure if they wanted to be seen, and instead, he shook his head and turned back to look at me. I was the best of us until we found you. I was a sergeant in the Army. It was a great honor for someone like me, solid C student who never amounted to much of anything. I was living pretty good, eating 3 meals a day, sleeping in a bed. I was respected, and people generally appreciated me. Then, and as he began, I saw his good eye cloud with memory. I ran over that IED while on patrol. I was the only survivor. My unit was killed on impact. I lost my arm, my leg, and my eye. While I was recovering, I became addicted to painkillers. When I retired from service, it followed me longer than my pension did. I'm an addict, but that's not that uncommon with us. After that, the others began to come forward. All of them were me, from some other reality or circumstance or what have you. The 2 that had picked me up were meth addicts, one of them a cook and one of them strictly a buyer. Several of them were drug mules, a means to pay for their habit. One of them was on disability after a fake slip and fall at a Costco had actually messed up 3 discs in his back. None of them were remotely what you would call successful. Few of them had even graduated high school. All of them were addicts to something, and the one who had served in the military was the only one who had ever held a real job. As I listened to them, I began to realize how good I had it. Most of them didn't have a home, few had cars, Most lived under the knowledge that their profession would eventually land them in jail. They made me look like a respectable citizen, but I wasn't sure what they wanted from me. I was no paragon of maturity. What did they expect? How did all of you get here? I asked, stalling for time. How did all of you find each other? It was me, said one of them from the back of the pack. He was a little guy, smaller than the rest somehow, and I realized that he was the only one of us who wasn't at our usual 5'8". He stepped forward, grinning gap-toothedly as he saw me sizing him up. Happened about a year ago. I needed money for any number of things, and I decided to be a part of some medical testing. Turned out to be less medical and more scientifical, and something that they gave me allowed me to travel between realities. I don't think that was their intentions. Nobody would give a junkie that kind of power, but when I realized what had happened, I looked for myself and found that I was here as well. I figured out that I could hold hands with somebody and they could travel with me. We went through this a few times. Several realities don't have you in them because you either overdosed or you did something stupid and got yourself killed. The fellows who are with us now are the ones that are still alive, the ones that are still sane. And when we got here and discovered how well adjusted you were, we knew we had to talk to you. Well adjusted? Me? That was the first time anyone had ever called me anything close to well adjusted, and it almost made me want to laugh. One look around told me they were serious, though. This was probably not the sort of crowd that you wanted to laugh at. We're attempting to find the clinical trial that gave this one his ability. We want to go help the others. We want to make them better than they are, but we need to find one of us who wasn't an absolute waste. You have a job, you have a life that isn't drugs, and you're the closest we found to a functional version of ourselves. We need to know how you did it. We need to know how we can make our lives better. I don't know why I'm wasting my time posting this rather than racking my brain for some core event that could make everything go away, but I guess if anything like this has ever happened to anyone else, maybe you could reach out. As for me, I guess I'm on my way to give myself the bad news. They aren't going to like it, but it seems my success is almost a fluke. It seems that I'm the best version I can be, and the idea is truly horrific.